Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, Canada is going the way of the Netherlands. We have some interesting updates on that today. These same types of policies created in the Netherlands to go after nitrates under the banner of global warming, targeting fertilizers in farms. The Canada is now putting almost the same policies in place, only maybe a bit larger scale. Like what they're doing is actually more encompassing. I'll be explaining this and talking about where that's going. Also, as an update just came in, Ireland is now doing the same thing. And frankly, as we mentioned previously, if it's one country doing it, it's one thing. If it's two countries doing it, fine. If it's like all around the world, you start wondering if something's at work. And we're going to be talking about this today. Also, as this is happening and people are worried about food, the New York Times is promoting cannibalism. I'll show you the New York Times articles and also what they're talking about. And also, we're going to have a great interview later on. I spoke with Senator Josh Hawley about the allegations around J6. So stick around for that too, folks. It's going to be a great episode today. And speaking of which, if you haven't seen the new J6 documentary, be sure to on Epoch TV. For those of you on YouTube, on Rumble, we can't talk about like a lot of that on YouTube, so we can't even show you the trailer on YouTube without them like deleting our channel or risking it. Remember, folks, they're giving you a free trial for Epoch TV. That's in the description below the video. Come over, join us. It's going to be great stuff. We do, again, a full hour-and-a-half episode, live Q&A, and we also have a lot of content like this one right here that you can only find on Epoch TV. So that said, folks, let's get started for the content. I'm going to go into, first of all, Canada and how Canada right now is following what the Netherlands did on the food restrictions. First of all, now this is Ottawa Sun. I'm going to show you this. It says Trudeau pushes ahead on fertilizer reduction as provinces and farmers cry foul. Provincial agricultural ministers are expressing frustration about the Trudeau government over plans to effectively reduce fertilizer use by Canada's farmers in the name of fighting climate change. The important caveat with this is that while in the Netherlands it's a fertilizer reduction program going after nitrates, in Canada they're using a broader program targeting global warming that in practice would constitute about a 30% reduction in fertilizers. Interestingly, about exactly the same as what's happening in the Netherlands. Now, further in it says the federal government is looking to impose a requirement to reduce nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizers, saying it is a greenhouse gas contributing to climate change. While the Trudeau government says they want a 30% reduction in emissions, not fertilizer, that's the technical caveat that they're trying to use that technicality to say it's not a fertilizer ban. It's a nitrous oxide emission restriction, which constitutes a 30% reduction in emissions targeting fertilizer, meaning a 30% reduction in fertilizer. It's like this play on words they're using to claim that it's not what it is, essentially. So when you see people saying, well, technically, maybe Snopes will say this, technically it's not a fertilizer ban, that's actually what they're referring to. It's extremely misleading, but this is, again, where the argument is. Now, it says further in, farm producer groups are saying this is the point that reducing nitrous oxide emissions cannot be done without reducing fertilizer use, and that's the issue. Similar to how in the Netherlands, they're noting that you can't reduce fertilizer use, or you can't reduce nitrates. Sorry, theirs is more targeting cows. Theirs is more targeting cows. You can't reduce nitrates without basically closing farms because of the profit margins being so thin that doing that basically means just farms going out of business. That's what it would actually look like in practice. It says here, several provincial governments and organizations representing farmers have asked for emission reductions from fertilizer to be measured via intensity, how much food is produced compared to the amount of fertilizer used. The Trudeau government is demanding an absolute reduction in emissions, which farmers say will result in less food being produced at a time when the world can ill afford it. Remember, in Africa, many countries, you are already having starvation. There is already, from a lot of the cuts and so on, already starvation in parts of Africa. And it's going to get worse, as even the UN is acknowledging. The United Nations itself is saying mass starvation. Now, further in, it says this. Farm groups like the Western Canadian wheat growers have said that the federal plan will reduce crop output, reduce income for farm families, and increase food prices in Canadian grocery stores. Another story here it's the governments in Saskatchewan. It says governments of Saskatchewan, Alberta disappointed in federal target for fertilizer emission reduction. And it says that these ministers of agriculture in both areas are expressing profound disappointment of the federal government fertilizer emissions reduction target. Fertilizer emissions reduction was not even a topic on the agenda of the annual meeting for the federal, provincial, territorial ministers of agriculture, who just finished a 3-day meeting in Saskatchewan. Provinces pushed the federal government to discuss this important topic, but were disappointed to learn that the target is already set, meaning they bypassed them. The commitment to future consultation are only to determine how to meet the target that Minister Trudeau and Minister Bibiu have already unilaterally imposed on this industry. So they bypassed these guys. They just went ahead and did it. They didn't have the option. They're very unhappy that these, again, provincial ministers couldn't do anything about it. And again, they did not consult them on whether this was even achievable or attainable, it's saying. It says Western Canadian farmers already produce the most sustainable agri-food products in the world, and they're continually being asked to do more with less. We cannot feed the growing world population with a reduction in fertilizer. Western Canadian producers base fertilizer inputs on realistic targets based on moisture availability. Producers are conservative in the use of fertilizer inputs and don't add more than what is needed because it's expensive. And also because they know how the soil works. You have to adjust it based on the soil, right? They alone simply can't shoulder the impact of this short-sighted policy. Now, briefly on that, remember we recently had the interview with this individual who is a USDA soil scientist. And he was noting that when you apply fertilizer to soil, there's a couple things you have to know. One, you can't just immediately go from, for example, chemical fertilizers to organic fertilizers like they did in Sri Lanka, without facing the outcome that places like Sri Lanka faced, where you have massive crop failures and where you have essentially just lower food output and people facing starvation. You can't do that in areas especially that are where the soil is accustomed to having chemical fertilizer, because the soil health begins to go down. And in jungle type climates like Sri Lanka or they have other areas too. If you were to do that, you do have some soil health. It can kind of take it. If you were to do that in the Midwest or areas where they've been using chemical fertilizers for a very long time, and the soil is basically used to that, and then you switch a 180, you're going to have dust bowls, as, again, the soil scientist said on our show just recently. In other words, you can't just do that. Now, in addition to just immediate transition to different types of fertilizers like this, the other issue you're facing is that, as they mentioned, you have to take into account moisture, other things, and you adjust the fertilizer based on the climate, based on temperatures, based on many other factors. If you were to just go ahead and say blanket, standardized from the top, this is how it has to be done, you don't take these minute factors into account. And when you don't take these minute factors into account, that's when you start having crop failures and other issues. This tends to be one of the problems you have with communist-type policies in general, or socialist-type policies in general, where you want to dictate from the top without taking into account the nuances that do exist on the grassroots level.